my name is Jennifer, and today I will also be refuting the claim that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is overdiagnosed. I will argue that the advocate's argument was ineffective in proving this claim. The advocate had 4 secondary claims. 1, that symptoms of ADHD can be attributed to other things. 2, that ADHD is not a biological disorder. And 3, that the diagnosis of ADHD is too subjective and broad, leading to overdiagnosis. And lastly, that researchers sometimes manipulate their research in order to strengthen their credence when they say that ADHD is a legitimate neurological disorder. The first secondary claim is that symptoms of ADHD can be attributed to other things. I have 2 responses to this. First, I would like to challenge the advocate's reasoning for this claim. In the first piece of evidence she used to support this claim, the advocate mentions that excessive fatigue or prolonged stress can produce the same symptoms of ADHD, implying that this causes overdiagnosis. My problem with this is that I don't see the relevance of this evidence. According to WebMD, in order to be diagnosed with ADHD, a child must show 6 or more specific symptoms of the disorder on a regular basis for more than 6 months in more than 2 settings. I find it very unlikely that the majority of young children being diagnosed were under prolonged stress and excessive fatigue for over 6 months in more than 2 different settings. I'm not trying to say that this evidence is wrong, I just don't see how it connects to the main claim that ADHD is overdiagnosed. Second, I would like to argue that the reasoning used in the third piece of evidence for this claim is also not sound. The advocate states that there has been a change in lifestyle in children and that they are watching more television and playing more computer games, and this causes a sensory addiction leading to a diminished attention span in children. I agree that this would cause an increase in the diagnosis of ADHD, but that does not necessarily mean that they are being misdiagnosed. This is just a change in our society that may lead to more causes of ADHD. A short attention span is one of the main symptoms. To make this evidence plausible, there would need to have been some sort of statistic showing that because of increased television and computer usage by children, that there are more misdiagnoses of ADHD. Otherwise, it's too big of an inferential leap for the audience to make. The second secondary claim was that ADHD is not a biological disorder. I have 1 response to this in the form of a counterclaim. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, studies using PET scans have shown that children with ADHD have significantly lower metabolic activity in the area of the brain that controls attention, social judgment, and movement than children without ADHD. The same study also found that children with ADHD may have lower levels of dopamine in these regions of the brain. It has also been found that children with ADHD have 5% smaller brain volumes than children without it. This is important because by claiming that ADHD is not a biological disorder when there is evidence that it is, the advocate's overall argument is weakened because one of her secondary claims can be easily proven false. The third secondary claim is that the diagnosis of ADHD is too subjective and broad, which leads to overdiagnosis. I would like to challenge the first piece of evidence used to support this claim. The advocate's first piece of evidence was that there are not any biological tests for diagnosing ADHD, so it is often very subjective. However, there are actual guidelines that must be followed. Here's a more detailed explanation of how ADHD is diagnosed. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, a diagnosis of ADHD is made when an individual displays at least 6 symptoms from a specified list, with some symptoms having started before age 7. Clear impairment in at least 2 settings, such as home and school or work, must also exist. Additionally, there must be clear evidence of clinically significant impairment in social, academic, or occupational functioning. So there obviously are some effective guidelines for diagnosing ADHD, even though they are not in the form of a biological test. This is significant because the advocate's only evidence to support this secondary claim dealt with biological tests, which completely left out the behavioral tests that do exist. The fourth and final secondary claim is that researchers sometimes manipulate their research in order to prove that ADHD is a legitimate neurological disorder. I would like to challenge the reasoning for this claim. Although it is an interesting point, it really has no relevance to the main proposition that ADHD is overdiagnosed. This secondary claim is talking about whether or not ADHD is a neurological disorder, and offers no connection to the main claim of ADHD being overdiagnosed. This weakens the argument significantly because it offers no support to prove the main claim. So after listening to my argument, I hope you can see the weaknesses in my advocacy tonight.
Well, I didn't know we were going to get those back to back, but that's okay. This is a little bit closer to what we're looking for in terms of simplicity. It's easier to follow as an oral argument. You do a brief summary of what the argument is that you're responding to, then you explain what your criticism of that particular point was, and you keep it relatively simple for the oral presentation. I like some of the things that you presented that really did a good job on this. For example, in talking about the causes of the problem, and they mentioned all those other kinds of things that could be contributing to it, you have a pretty straightforward response. The fact that there are other things that can be contributing to it doesn't mean that it is not being diagnosed correctly or that it is being overdiagnosed. I think that's a pretty reasonable answer to make, and that's just a straightforward, rational analysis of the advocate's evidence versus their claim. I did like the counter evidence also that suggested, look, we do have relevant criteria for determining what people have ADHD, and it's not something simple like might be implied by the advocate's argument. They have to have 6 symptoms in 2 different settings over a course of 6 months in order to make an inference that somebody is suffering from this particular disease. And I thought that you used that effectively in 2 different spots. The same sort of thing with increase in diagnosis doesn't automatically mean misdiagnosis. It sounded a little bit like a critique here rather than an argument, but ultimately I think the inference is that the advocates basically made a generalization here that is not supported by the evidence that's being presented. Then we get some of the same argument that we heard in the other speech, talking about the metabolism and in the brain and the dopamine levels and all those kinds of things. And I think that there's a good argument here that suggests that it is in fact a legitimate disease and that there are physical characteristics to it. The one thing I thought might have been interesting would be if there are other diseases that you could compare to that don't have tests per se. They don't have tests per se, but they have symptoms that they go by. In other words, there's not a physical test to determine something like that. Are there other diseases like that? One pops into my mind immediately that fits in that category, where doctors have to make a diagnosis of a disease without any physical test for that, and that's Alzheimer's. Which is also a disorder of the brain. It's tough to do that. You can't always stick kids under a scan and look at their brain to diagnose them, but we can see all these symptoms. I think that would be a good way to respond. All right, thank you. We got to shorten this